Today, we're discussing the most visible sign of the economic slowdown, these snaking queues at Centrelink that we haven't seen the likes of in Australia really for more than 30 years. The labour market impacts of COVID-19 have already been absolutely massive, and we've only really been in this thing now for about 3 weeks. So today we're going to start teasing out what those changes tell us about the next 12 months and what does the long view look like. Now, I'm very lucky to have two of Australia's biggest policy brains here to help me get into some of these critical questions. So I want to welcome Jeff Borland, who is a globally recognised labour market economist. I think he's the best in the business. He does these super cool labour market snapshots that I think have never been more hotly anticipated than they are right now. And we have Danielle Wood, one of the smartest people in Australia, a policy wonk supremo, and soon to take over as head of the Grattan Institute in Melbourne. So Jeff and Danielle, thank you so much for joining me today on The Long View.
Thanks for having us, Claire.
Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, so anecdotally, virtually everyone I talk to at the moment has a family member or a friend who has been stood down or lost their job completely. And I know for all of us we're experiencing when we're out on the roads, there's no one there. So there's clearly the economy has ground to a halt in one respect or another. So Jeff, I'm interested in you just outlining for us, what does the big picture look like here? Who is losing work at the moment and why?
Well, Claire, I guess one of the really notable things about this episode that everyone would understand is its concentration on particular industries. So industries like food and entertainment, so cafes and clubs and hotels, accommodation, tourism, arts, recreation, sports are really being sort of severely affected. And we know who works in those industries, so we can say something about who it is who's being impacted. No one's immune, so all groups of workers are being affected. This is such an extensive downturn that everyone's being hit to some degree. But in those industries, there's above average proportions of young workers, above average proportions of females, casual and part-time workers who are going to be affected.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because those are people who we would see in the labour market are often a bit more precarious in their employment conditions. And you make that really interesting point, Jeff, about how this has started in certain industries, and that's where we're seeing that immediate impact of unemployment and lack of work. Danielle, can you just tell us a bit more about what you're going to expect to see over the next 12 months and perhaps even beyond this? Do you think this is going to bleed into other sectors and therefore have an employment impact beyond the specific areas we're seeing at the moment?
Absolutely. So it starts in the shutdown industries that Jeff has already pointed to, but what we're going to start seeing playing out is some significant second round effects. So in a world in which you've shut down a significant fraction of your economy, incomes are reduced across the board, both for businesses and for households, what we're going to see is less spending, particularly on things like consumer durables. People are feeling uncertain, they've got lower incomes, and then that starts to bleed into all the other parts of the economy. That's already happening now. I mean, we can see consumer confidence is the lowest in 50 years. Business confidence came out today. Again, the lowest since they've been taking the survey. And 2/3 of businesses that the ABS have talked to have already experienced a cash flow hit. So that's much bigger than the sector that's been shut down.
Yeah.
So those second round effects potentially even dwarf the first round effects of the shutdown, which means that we can expect to see, I think, a much weaker labour market for a long time to come. So this potentially has quite a long tail.
Yeah. It's interesting, once you see that sort of level of unemployment hit a certain point, it starts to feed on itself, doesn't it? Because people don't have money in the bank, so they're not going out and creating jobs for others through their spending. Danielle, I'm just interested, there's been a bit of discussion about how the recovery will look, and I think the multi-trillion-dollar question is, how long is coronavirus going to last? What's your level of confidence about the notion that this will look like a V shape? So basically that the labour market would bounce down as people lost work, but it would effectively bounce back up again pretty quickly after we changed the restrictions that are dampening down economic activity. What's your view about that now?
Look, I think it's highly unlikely we're looking at a V. Interestingly, the IMF has put out some work that does suggest We may see a V in advanced economies, but that relies on, one, us being able to open pretty quickly and not taking a significant hit to our productive capacity. So not having firms going out of business, not having long-term unemployment. What I think is a much more likely scenario is a world in which we sort of start to slowly open things up, but there will be some hit to the productive capacity of the economy, and unemployment therefore takes a long time to come down. And, that is the experience of every significant economic downturn, is it tends to take about twice as long to come down as it did to go up. And, given the second round effects of this crisis and the sort of demand-driven effects, I don't think that we should assume that this one would be any different to that.
Okay, we've got some tough times ahead. So, Jeff, just for our interest, how should we be tracking the impacts on the labour market of what's going on? I'm asking that because we've seen some estimates of unemployment that have said we're going to hit double digits, but others have looked at more anecdotally how people are experiencing the current climate and said unemployment's actually much higher than it looks based on the unemployment rate. Can you tell us why the unemployment rate may not be the best indicator of what's happening in the labour market, and what numbers should we be looking at to really give us an accurate picture of what's happening?
Yeah, so as you and Danielle were just saying, I guess there's different views about sort of the way the recovery, which hopefully will start sort of soon, but the way that will happen, whether it's a V or whether it's a slower process of coming back. And so obviously sort of which of those occurs matters a lot for policy making, and so you want to be looking at the right measures to understand what's happening in the labour market. And a point that I've made is that I guess with the job keeper scheme, the unemployment rate is going to be, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to make inferences from the unemployment rate than usually, in the sense that you are counted as employed if you are away from work, but essentially are being paid by your employer. So what I expect to see in the labour force statistics is a lot more of what we call 0 hours workers who are said to be employed, but in the time at which the weeks in which the labour force survey is done are actually working 0 hours. So I think one example of sort of a good measure that we want to look at to work out how the labour market's going is the ABS measure of actual hours worked. That will give us a handle on sort of how much work actually is being done. The unemployment rate will tell us something, but it's going to be a bit of a imprecise measure of what's actually happening in the labour market.
So really effectively through JobKeeper, the Australian government is subsidising the employment of people who may not be working many hours, basically. So if we look at the unemployment rate, they're going to appear technically as being employed, but they may not be working really, and they may still be experiencing a real income hit in their household too.
Yeah, that's possible.
Yep. Okay. So I'd love to bring the conversation now back to some specific groups of people who I'm really concerned about, just looking at what's happened over the last couple of weeks. Of course, we don't just have one labour market in Australia. We have different workers in different regions and different parts of industry who are kind of competing against each other. I just want to start quickly with high-skill workers. We normally see in a downturn that high-skill workers are not as badly affected by the economic impacts that create the downturn, and then they can quickly recover out of them and get back the wages that they were making before. Is that what you would expect, Jeff, to see in this downturn? Do you think high-skilled workers are going to be okay here?
I think on average, that is the case, Claire. I think, as you said, that's usually what we see. I think if we go back to sort of at least the immediate effects of this downturn, the type of industries which are being affected on average sort of lower skill industries. The one sort of caveat to that is that because whole industries are being hit in this downturn, there are some high skill workers within those industries that you might usually think of as being protected who aren't. So example might be airline pilots, for example, as one highly skilled group who are being hit. Lots of workers in the arts and recreation, sports sectors are high skilled, and they're being hit because of the shutdown of those industries. I know various AFL clubs where there are people with like PhDs in statistics who've been thrown out of work because of the clubs needing to cut their workforces. So in general, yeah, I think you're completely right. But one thing that's a little bit different is that there are these kind of particular groups of high-skilled workers in the industries which have been hardest hit.
Yeah, again, seeing that sort of distinctive economic impact because this has started in such specific sectors of the economy, hasn't it? And Danielle, just you talked a little bit about second round effects before. So coming back to the question about high skill workers, do you think as this bleeds into other parts of the economy, we're going to see that awful impact for some people who are actually quite well educated?
I do believe I'm probably less sanguine about these impacts than maybe Jeff is. I think that, if absolutely it started in these sectors that tend to have more low-paid, low-skill workers. But let's look at where the second round is going to impact. All sorts of professional services firms I think are going to take a hit. I know that a lot of the big accounting firms are already worried about this. Deloitte's making all their staff take a week of leave in April, for example. Yeah. Those sorts of businesses in a world in which firms aren't spending, households aren't putting their hands into their pockets, this starts to bleed right across the board. And, I just don't think they're going to be immune. And the longer this shutdown lasts, the more significantly it's going to start hitting big corporates. And I think, if we're still here in 6 months' time in a full lockdown type world, we're going to be seeing a lot more businesses put their hand up for bailouts from the government. We're talking about Virgin now. We could be talking about a lot of other firms in 6 months' time. And to think that high skill workers are somehow going to avoid that fallout, I think they will also be experiencing job losses and potentially wage cuts.
Yeah, right. Again, thinking back to the length of this really is going to drive it, isn't it? How far it bleeds into other sectors of the economy. So I'd like to get your views about men and women and how they're going to experience this a bit differently. One of the interesting features about the labour market in Australia is it's one of the most gendered in the world. So that sort of means that we've got occupations which are very dominated by women. So thinking about something like childcare, where I think 97% of childcare workers are female, and other types of jobs which are very dominated by males, and that's construction's a good example there. So Jeff, can I just get a quick read from you? I think we're going to find that the big story here is actually about female workers, but can you talk to us first a bit about men in the labour market? Are there any specific impacts here that you see for Australian male workers?
Well, males are definitely being affected by the downturn. I mean, as you said, I think the point is no groups, it's such an extensive downturn that there are no groups who are immune. It's really sort of a matter of groups being affected to a lesser or greater degree. We were just talking about, skill as one example of where, high skill may not be affected to as large a degree as lower skill workers. And I think males are going to be affected, but again, looking at the industries where the immediate impact is, one feature of those industries is that they're above average in terms of female employment. Another point is that I guess some of the male-dominated occupations like construction and mining are occupations that the government hasn't decided to, or industries the government hasn't decided to close down yet. I guess a lot of talk about sort of attempts to boost manufacturing industry and other male-dominated areas, sort of, which may benefit males. So males will be affected, but I agree with you that I think both from the labour demand side and the labour supply side, this episode is one where you want to give a lot more attention to the female side of the story in the labour market.
Yeah. Although I'm really interested, Jeff, to see how the policy conversation plays out here. You mentioned, there's a sort of, everything that's old is new again feel about public policy at the best of times. But to think that suddenly manufacturing's back in the cornerstone of what Australia's economy should be able to do onshore. I'm thinking also about food security and agriculture. So there's some very male-dominated industries here that we may see a resurgence of, and watch this space for where that goes. So, Danielle, can I talk to you now about female-dominated industries? So you don't have to know anything about labour market economics to see that things like healthcare, aged care, retail are right at the forefront of some of these changes. What do you think that those more female-dominated industries are going to experience through this crisis?
It's interesting. They are at the forefront, as you say, and there's a lot of others that we might not think about, like supermarket checkout operators, cleaners, also quite female dominated. So we have this whole sections of the economy where we're asking people to go to work. We're asking them to take some degree of risk. Often they are low-paid jobs. A lot of those fall into the low-paid occupation. There's no sort of risk payment that might be in their current awards, which, you know, some of the more risky sectors that men work in, like construction, there's some sort of compensation in there. For these people, we're saying, you know, you are essential. We need you to go to work and take this risk. They're not compensated for that. So I think there's an interesting discussion longer term around how we view these workers, how we reward these workers, and whether they are actually getting fair pay for the type of work that they do.
Yeah, it's been fascinating just to see with our own eyes who really keeps the country running. And it's not actually the people who, sit at a desk all day, actually, as many of us do, and probably many people listening to this podcast do. It's childcare workers and truckies who are keeping the food rolling and all the rest of it. So, yeah, I'm really interested, as you are, to just see in the medium term, does the politics of this actually change a little bit for us? Because the contribution, especially of people working in those caring professions, has just become so apparent to everyone. So we'll see where that goes. Danielle, I'm just interested, the other thing that's making a big change, I think, for women is suddenly the childcare burden. And I say burden as the loving mother of 2 wonderful children. It just got astronomical. So how do you think that's going to shake out through Australian families as men and women struggle to cope with, you know, what may be a doubling of their childcare load in the household?
Yeah, I think, you know, this is something that's being kind of negotiated in real time. And I actually think, you know, when I think about one of the impacts of this crisis, we may well actually see a shrinking in income inequality because of things like the JobKeeper payment. But I think we're going to see a big rise in time inequality. So single parents particularly going to feel this, but also couples where both parents are working. All of a sudden they've got this additional 7 hours a day that they're going to need to find that, you know, normally their kids are in school to look after them. So we come into this crisis as quite a gendered nation in terms of the way we spend our time. So Australian women much more likely to work part-time than in most other countries. Also do a sort of disproportionate share of household chores, including child rearing, compared to most other countries. I think with the exceptions of Japan and South Korea, we have the most gendered division of labour. So how does this play out? There's sort of 2 schools of thought. One is in a world where we're all there on top of each other and we can see what everyone's doing, you actually get a bit of a renegotiation. All of a sudden it just seems really unfair that the woman's doing all the housework because you can see it, and you get a better sharing of those tasks. That's the optimistic view.
Highly optimistic in my view.
The way I think is probably more likely is we end up seeing that additional time split more along the lines of the normal kind of burden. So women take the lion's share of it. That then entrenches those kind of patterns or disparities that we already see, and of course then makes it harder for the woman to handle her workload. So, you know, she might be the one that ends up taking the career hit during this period because she's picking up the majority or the lion's share of that the caring load.
Yeah, fascinating question, and I really am going to be tracking closely how this unfolds. One of the things I'm just thinking of is when we see other examples in the working life of men and women where the childcare burden escalates quickly and women take that on. I'm just thinking about the way we've structured maternal parental leave versus in Australia quite a limited paternal parental leave. So dad doesn't get as long at home with baby is what I'm saying. That kind of has very long-lasting impacts on the way that parents see their role as carers for children. And I'm really worried that we're basically doubling down on that a bit later in life. So because women do tend to be the second income earners, they're going to basically solidify their role as primarily responsible for the child's education. And this could have implications that go well beyond even the wages that woman's earning. It's about how she thinks about her career path and all the rest of it. So
yeah, I think that's exactly right. So we know that first year entrenches patterns. So there's no reason to think that, you know, if you're doing that later in your career, that's also going to entrench patterns. And the implications for that for lifetime earnings are absolutely massive. So we actually just did this modelling exercise where we said, okay, well, let's assume we've got a 25-year-old woman, 25-year-old man, assume work patterns kind of stay the same as they have for previous generations. What does it look like? Well, if that man and woman don't have children, they'll earn, a man will earn a little bit more over his lifetime, about 4 million, woman on about 3.8. If those two go on to have children, that man will earn on average about 5 million over his lifetime. The woman's just over 3. So there's a huge difference in earnings between men and women if they have children at the moment, about 40% over a lifetime. That has mammoth implications for women and their economic security. If they all were coupled and they stayed together incomes, for their lives, that would be fine, but people divorce. Women are left with less earning potential, less super. So I think anything that reinforces those divisions that are already there potentially leaves women more exposed, and that's a real concern.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so fascinating to talk more about this, and I just have to tell you, and Jeff, for your interest in this topic too, I'm a mum with kids who are now staying home from school. My social media feed is just full of women talking about how am I going to handle this, and that's really all that women are talking about to me at the moment. So it's just really fascinating. Anecdotally, that's what I see. It's women who are saying this is now my job and somehow we're going to grapple it, and of course men are taking some responsibility, but interesting to see where it goes. So the other group that I am incredibly concerned about in all of this is young people, Jeff, and I know you've done some recent work looking at what happens to a young person when they enter the labour market into the type of conditions that have been created by COVID-19. So can you tell us a little bit about what we should be looking for in terms of impacts on young people?
So, yeah, I'm extremely concerned about prospects for young people as well. I think even before this episode, I'd done work, and I know Danielle and Grattan had done work, pointing out the fact that the last decade sort of it had got more difficult for young people to get into employment. So you take that, then combine that with this episode, and we know that in downturns, young people always experience sort of the worst consequences because they're the ones who are trying to get into the labour market, and in downturns, job creation's slow, so they just don't have the opportunities to get in. Plus the fact that in this downturn, as we talked about before, the industries where the immediate impact has been are ones where there's disproportionately sort of young people working. And the fact that for all its merits, the JobKeeper scheme sort of freezes sort of employment as it is in a way, which is also going to make it a bit harder for young people to get in. I'm sort of really worried about prospects for young people in the labour market. So I think what we're going to see is people extending their period in education, which of course for a lot of people will mean they end up with higher HECS debt. I think we're going to see more young people having to make transition to employment through extended periods of part-time employment. I think we're going to see higher rates of unemployment. I think we're going to see young people doing more of the type of competition they've been having to do to get jobs, like unpaid internships. So I think it's really going to see all of the things that we'd been seeing sort of in the past decade, but just turbocharged.
What could you tell us a bit about this concept of crowding out? So this is about what do older people in the labour market do as a consequence of what's happened to them and how that affects young people?
So yeah, that's I guess another factor which I suspect is going to make it harder for young people, which is that we know that share prices have decreased a lot. The value of people's superannuation holdings will have decreased a lot. You might expect that will cause some people who would have been going to retire sort of in the next couple of years to perhaps delay their retirement to allow their superannuation balances to be rebuilt. People apart from young people sort of who are in employment have this incumbency advantage that they're in the jobs. And so, even if labour demand starts increasing, sort of in a sense that gets taken up by people who delay retirement. So that issue of people delaying retirement, that's another factor which is just going to make it harder for young people, I think.
Yeah. Okay, Jeff, I'm going to come back to you in a sec to ask for what ideas you want policymakers to be thinking about, just as a subtle hint to me and others who may be listening. But before we get to that, Danielle, I just want to get your read here. One of the things that this literature about young people tells us is that that these effects actually can persist for a very long time. Like, it's not just that these young people take a 6-month hit as they enter the labour market. Could you tell us what are scars, what economists call scars?
Yeah, so economists spend a lot of time worrying about this sort of scarring impact of unemployment, which is why a lot of our policy is geared around trying to make sure you don't get these sort of awful hits to the labour market. But, the idea of scars is really if you're hitting the job market while you're in the midst of a significant downturn like this, it's very difficult to get a job. You might have to take a job that's a long way from your skill set. You might have to take part-time work, as Jeff has pointed to. And that causes your human capital to degrade somewhat. You're not on that normal career trajectory you might hope when you sort of first enter the job market, or if you can't get a job at all, you can lose confidence and job readiness. All of that affects your career path over the long term. And as you point to, there's a whole literature in the US that talks about this. This is not just about the 6 months you're out of work. This is still having ramifications on your earnings, on your likelihood of being employed, on your probability that you're employed in the area that you're trained in 10 years or more down the track. So that's bad for the economy because you're not using your people at capacity. And it's obviously really dreadful for the individuals that are involved.
Yeah. Something else that I'm thinking about here is the pace at which the stock market will recover versus the pace at which the employment market will recover. So I think once we have a clear picture of how COVID will end, the share market will make a big recovery because that's really about the future and valuing the future. But the unemployment rate will stay high for a lot longer. So there's a whole bunch of really complicated intergenerational questions here, aren't they? So what should politicians be thinking of? We've got to address this issue about young people. Jeff, let's start with you. What's just one thing that you think we could do policy-wise to make a material impact for young people?
Well, I think the biggest thing isn't really a young person specific thing. It's just to, I guess, get the recovery going as quickly as possible. The number one thing that you can do to benefit young people is to make the rate of new job creation as high as possible, as fast as possible. The thing that will allow young people to move into jobs is general macroeconomic activity recovering. Really, apart from that, what you're trying to do is just, maintain sort of, contact between young people and the labour market, help them develop their skills before the time when they can move into employment. But, getting employment growth going again as quickly as possible is the big number one.
Yeah. Okay. Just that simple thing of getting the economy growing again, Jeff. Yeah. And Danielle, how about you? What do you think we should be thinking about for young people?
So I think if there is going to be a period where they're just not going to be able to find jobs, you want to be thinking about how do we use that time. So one thing I really like about the design of the job keeper payment, and this will only apply for young people that are able to access it, so they have to have been employed prior to the crisis and their employer has to be eligible, but it means that they will be getting income during the period. They will stay attached to their employer, and if they're not able to work, the employer could perhaps use that as an opportunity to say, let's do some training.
Yeah.
We're giving you $1,500 a fortnight. Let's use this chance to, give you leadership training or skills training here, or, some sort of online chance to build up their skills and make them more valuable and productive when they come back into the workforce on the other side. For people that aren't in work and don't have the benefit of the JobKeeper program, I do like the announcement that the government made about funding more university short courses. So this idea that universities are now going to offer 6 months courses in skills that will probably be needed on the other side. You'll get some kind of qualification, and that's just going to make you more employable. It's not going to solve the problem by any means, but it gives some young people a better chance of bouncing back.
Good. Thanks, Danielle. So I guess that's a really beautiful segue into a discussion about opportunities here. This conversation's been a bit dark, and I apologise for that, but unemployment's just a horrible thing and there's no good thing about it at all. But we'd be fools to not also have our mind to, is there an opportunity here for the country to address some underlying issues in the labour market that we could look at because so much of the workforce is actually ramped down for a period of time? So, Jeff, coming to you, if you could pick one structural problem in the labour market for governments to run headlong at right now, what would it be?
I guess one thing I'd say is sort of a note of caution that I think, don't try and work on too many problems at once. Sort of like, I think it's it's obviously a major undertaking, and trying to deal with this scale of downturn, and I think we're going to find, as we've been talking about in this conversation, that it's a moving target as well. We don't know how COVID's going to evolve. We're still learning about how the economy has reacted to the shutdowns and so on. So I think, we got to kind of start by accepting that if we get to the end of this episode and we feel like it's been managed successfully through this, then you'd want to give a big tick to government departments and policymakers. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point you make as well, Claire, that that I think these times sort of sometimes present sometimes they make obvious imperatives for policy. Sort of, I think, like, I'm not necessarily saying this is the biggest policy. One example, is casual employment. Sort of, I think there's been lots of discussion sort of in recent years about, is casual employment, is it going up or is it going down? Sort of, and I think what this has exposed, the real issue is actually the level of casual employment, not whether it's been increasing or decreasing recently. So I think maybe we need to have a discussion about sort of that as a type of employment, what we think the benefits and costs are of sort of flexibility versus what's being exposed as problematic aspects during this episode.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Jeff, because that use of casualisation really pushes the risk onto the individual, and once you get to a certain share of the workforce who own that risk completely, you actually introduce a big structural weakness, don't you? So that basically we've got a good 30% of the workforce, depending on how you define a casual, who are kind of fending for themselves in the face of these problems. And I think the government's recognised the unsustainability of that really by making JobKeeper apply to casuals, though I need to say that Labor wanted it to go further, but it's not a political podcast, so hopefully you don't mind. But I think that's a really good one. And just to your point about, should we use this as a chance to try to break off big other problems, and I completely get your point. And I think one of the big issues for politicians here is not to think that this is actually the moment to completely reshape our society, and I don't have that view. But coming out of the private sector into Parliament as I have, I just know that that's how companies will see this. This they won't enjoy what's happening, but they will use it as a chance to take a cold look at the way that they conduct business and make big structural shifts while there's a downturn, rather than doing it when the market's at a high. So I'm just thinking, can we take those opportunities? Perhaps not. But Danielle, what's your view here? If you had a magic wand and could fix something through this policy response to the crisis, what would you be looking at?
Something that's sort of I've grappled with for a long time, and I don't have a clear answer to it, but is this sort of broad disconnect between the amount people are remunerated and their marginal social value, if I can put it that way. And that is obviously a huge, complex issue. It comes down to sort of cultural issues and biases. It's gendered in some ways.
You're talking here about nurses, aged care workers, childcare
exactly,
workers,
these sort of workers that are contributing a lot and are not remunerated particularly well. It's partly because you have government interaction in those sectors which can keep wages down. So there's all sorts of factors that play into that. I mean, as I said before, I think we'll come out on the other side of this and we'll realise who is essential. These people that have gone to work in risky situations to keep the economy moving, to keep our children looked after, all of those things. And I do wonder if it will cause some kind of reevaluation of those. I don't think those sort of issues will be fixed overnight, but I expect there is an opportunity there to address some of those what have been really long-term issues for those particular sectors.
Set out a pathway. And of course, that's back to the gender question a little bit, isn't it? We've got really good evidence that as women amalgamate in parts of the workforce, their bargaining power seems to diminish, and as men come into different types of the workforce, their bargaining power seems to increase. So there's got to be a policy response to that in a way, doesn't it? So very interesting points of view. I'm just thinking there's another structural question I have about, often downturns kind of turbocharge things that were already underway in the economy. And I'm thinking here about automation and also the growing and very unmet demand for digital skills in the Australian economy. And it feels like these two things are ever present, but are going to be so sharpened by what's going on with COVID at the moment. Jeff, can you just tell us a little bit about the JobKeeper policy, which I think everyone's very much in favour of, but it is going to have some impacts that will restrict people's movement around the labour market. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're expecting there?
Well, I think the JobKeeper program is doing what it needs to do, which is getting us through the critical phase of this downturn in the next 6 months. But we can't see that as the only policy thinking or policy response we need to this episode. As you just mentioned, Claire, downturns are periods of accelerated structural change often. So it may be that, for example, businesses crowd a lot of technological change sort of that they would have been implementing over the next 5 years into the next sort of into the next 6 months. It may be a period of accelerated business closure and structural change in that way. There may be longer term implications of the type that Danielle was talking about, where there's some type of rolling back of international trade or engagement with international supply chains by producers in Australia. And I think so the next phase of sort of policy thinking has to be thinking about, well, okay, what are these kind of big structural changes that are going to that may be likely to come out of this episode, and thinking about how we need to respond to that in terms of, for example, things like training and education, facilitating the sort of adjustment that's going to come out of the episode.
Yeah. And Jeff, what do you think about the impact of JobKeeper on people's ability to address that personally? So, for example, if I'm on JobKeeper at the moment and I can see pre-COVID big opportunities in a more digital version of what I do, it feels like I'm not going to take the risk and make that transition now. Do you see that as something that we might need to think about in public policy as JobKeeper does its critical role of helping people over this initial burst? What do we do next when actually there might need to be some structural shifts from workers to different industries, and JobKeeper may be stopping us from doing that? As
time goes on, if we see some of the health restrictions being taken off, for example, and economic activity starting to build up again, then maybe you become a little bit less concerned about sort of the income maintenance aspects of policy, and you become more concerned about sort of running the economy sort of efficiently again and allowing sort of dynamics and adjustment to happen. So I think it's about timing, sort of the addressing the policy problems as they become a priority, and so as hopefully sort of recovery picks up soon, sort of then you start to worry about the issue of like, okay, we've got to be doing things that allow people to get into the jobs that they're best suited for.
Yeah. I'm just I'm thinking about the role that our productivity problem in Australia has in this whole conversation. A big part of that is that we've got a bunch of skills that are needed in the economy and a bunch of people that can do different things. And we don't want to have in the long term a policy that prevents the transition that needs to happen from taking place. So Danielle, what thoughts do you have about this? Do you have any concerns about the impact of JobKeeper potentially solidifying actually long-standing skills mismatches that we have?
Look, I think we could see it the other way. I think we could see it as an opportunity to help address those. So in a world in which a lot of people are going to be staying home for the duration of the shutdown, and it's a great thing, as Jeff has already said, that we're giving them the income support to be able to make it through that period. But in that world where people have more time on their hands, that can be an opportunity to look at developing new skills. We're in a fantastic world where there is just a plethora of online courses and study options. We have the government saying that they're going to support universities in Australia to offer 6 months courses for skills that are going to be in demand in the future. So there is an opportunity here, I think, for people to skill up It may be that their employer comes to them, and says, "Well, you're on JobKeeper. I want you to do this particular course to help you skill up in this profession." So I think we can use this time well and in a way that will boost productive capacity in the long term, but it really relies on workers, employers and government making sure that that's what we're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you've talked a little bit about employers and assisting their employees to develop new skills. My thinking obviously is about government and how it should think a bit strategically about this. One of my frustrations about the skills sector in Australia is that government's been so hands-off when we actually know where jobs growth is going to be in many instances. We're not doing the things we need to do to communicate that to people who are potential workers in those future industries and assist them in training. Or we see very few examples. One of them is the free TAFE that's gone on in skills shortage areas in Victoria. I mean, surely it just seems like such a no-brainer at a time like this that we'd be using public policy to do exactly what Danielle Andrews has done here.
Yeah, look, I think that's right. I think it's always struck me as strange, the kind of the information asymmetry. You've got all these students signing up for university courses and, we say things like, oh, you should do STEM, and then they all sign up for biology and there's no jobs at the end of it. So, giving them some kind of picture or steer as, these are the jobs where we think there's a huge level of demand. Sign up here makes a lot of sense to me.
So there's the Treasury microdata unit, I guess at the end of last year, brought out their working papers showing that, getting workers into the most productive firms is a really, really important driver of productivity growth. So if we are concerned about productivity growth, then I think you're exactly right to point to this issue of getting the right amount of adjustment in the labour market happening as being a major policy issue. And then that's obviously about sort of impediments to adjustment. It's about having workers with the right skills that firms want to hire them. So I think it's, it is one of those, notwithstanding what I said before about not taking on too many problems, I think these are episodes of accelerated structural change. So, being in a good position to sort of meet that accelerated structural change is really important sort of policy issue to address, especially as we get into the period of recovery in this episode.
Yeah. The question is, how do we get the Treasury microdata unit to have a better conversation with the 17-year-olds who are finishing year 11 this year in my electorate? So lots to think about there. Okay, so we're going to finish up our conversation today with our COVID-19 quickfire round. So, best book for lockdown. Danielle, what have you been reading?
So I've found that I can only handle novels.
the
thought of taking on non-fiction is just too...
Get it.
So the best one I've come across, which is a few years old, but I kind of missed it at the time, was called The Power by Naomi Alderman.
Okay.
It's a fantastic book. The premise is really that teenage girls around the world all of a sudden discover that they have this kind of electromagnetic power and they can shock people and harm them. And then that then spreads to women, and because women then become the more physically powerful group, there's an entire reevaluation of the power structures in society. So it's kind of just a fascinating thought exercise of what changes in a world where who's physically powerful turns around.
Okay.
So, if you're talking about reevaluation of society, that's a good one, and it's just a cracking read as well.
I love it. Okay, and how about you, Jeff? What have you been reading?
So I've got a bit of a more somber theme for you. So this is The Great Influenza by John Barry, which I guess when this started...
How do you get out of bed in the morning, mate? Oh.
It's mainly about the influenza in how it played out in America, but it's actually got fantastic section explaining all about coronavirus and influenza.
Oh, right.
At the end of the book, Barry actually sort of meditates on what did we learn from that period? What have we learned from SARS and episodes since then for policymakers? And if you don't believe sort of like history has anything to teach us, he has this amazing paragraph where he actually says, hopefully the Chinese will have learned from SARS that what you should do is not try and hide these things that you need to publicise them and jump on them. So it's a fantastic example of how we can learn from history, and we ignore it at our peril. It's just a really good book as well.
Sounds essential reading. And Danielle, what about the best tech or app you've discovered so far?
So ABC Reading Eggs has been popular in my house. It's a paid app, a sort of educational app for children, but it's a good chance to distract them with some screen time, but feel like you're doing the right thing because they're learning.
Yes, I'm all about that sort of thing.
Sort of guilt-free,
feel good screen time. Yep.
Indeed, I think Zoom has been the other one for me that's been a bit of a revelation.
Turns out we don't have to be all in the same room at the same time. Yep. And how about you, Jeff? What have you discovered anything new on that side of things? I know you're a huge tech.
I discovered how to hyperlinking text actually a couple of days ago. That was big for me. Now, you don't want technology advice from me, so I'm going to give you another book advice. So this is the hidden gem. So Vicky Hastrick, she's an Australian author. She just published this book of essays, Night Fishing, which is really good. But even better is this novel she wrote, The Great Arch. No one seems to have heard of it, but it's brilliant, sort of. So much humanity in it and a wonderful story. So don't listen to me on technology, but please take those book suggestions.
I like the way you're just making this your own, Jeff. I really do appreciate that. Okay,
well, you said it was like a dinner party, Claire. So actually, you may have noticed I did the dinner party equivalent before of sort of spilling the wine. I managed to knock my computer.
Danielle, back to you. One trend that you think will outlast this crisis?
I'm hoping bread baking. I'm enjoying the kind of Instagram bread porn going on. Although I can't even get yeast to participate myself. So it's obviously taken off in a big way. And I wonder if people will just be like, it's actually not that hard to make your own bread. Let's keep doing it.
And how about you, Jeff? What's one trend you think will outlast the crisis?
I really hope sort of the attention to kind of public hygiene and hygiene. Like, I really didn't realise how many people do die from influenza sort of every year, even apart from COVID. And so, if we could sort of save, suppose, we do have the happy outcome of a vaccine to COVID, being discovered, but not influenza, then, just keeping up the, cleaning and hygiene to try and, save lives from influenza, I think that would be fantastic.
Interesting. Okay. And Danielle, what is the first thing you'll do after the lockdown is completely lifted?
I think I will sprint to my local cafe, sit down and have a coffee and have a chat with my barista who I'm missing a lot.
And how about you, Jeff?
So I have a similar one. I guess I'm treating it as my own again, to give a bit of a plug. So my niece had spent 4 months getting all ready to open her cafe, which is called Avenue Baking Co. in Tucker Road, McKinnon. And it was due to open on March 24, which is, of course, the day that the government announced that all cafes would be closed. So
poor girl,
she's
that's
open
terrible.
for takeaway, but I'm really looking forward to being able to go, like Danielle said, and actually sit down in a cafe and have some food and a cup of tea.
I love it. Okay. Well, guys, thank you so much for talking to us today on The Long View. It's been the most fascinating conversation, and keep safe out there. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Claire.